Welcome, everybody. Thanks for meeting with us on a Monday morning. I'm really looking forward to doing this. I haven't been in the classroom in a few years, so it's always fun to sort of go through, talking about film literacy and film language. And just give you an overview of what I'm going to do the first hour or so, the first 50 minutes. I'm going to walk you through the basics of film language using clips. Now, I'm assuming that some of you are already doing this in your classroom. So I will get into details and things like that about shots, editing, camera work, all of the nitty gritty that you could bring to bear on using this in your classroom. And these clips that I've chosen are just examples. You can definitely apply the techniques to other films. We're going to take a 5 to 8 minute break around just before 10, around 10 o'clock. And then the last hour, we're going to do about 45 minutes of activities, really just 2 activities that you can participate in and use in your classrooms. And then at the end, we'll leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions. I don't know, Elizabeth, correct me if you want to do this a different way, but as questions come to you, you can put them in the chat or just, keep them in your head, jot them down. So that's what we're going to do. I want to start with a quote here, which I think is pertinent to why to teach film literacy. All right, can everybody see that? All right, take a minute to read through this, or 2 minutes. What I like about this clip, it's, as I have the site here, it comes from a book called Critical Approaches to Comics. That part I highlighted, there probably will not be any gunfire or fistfights, but conducting a critical analysis and presenting your case can still be challenging and thrilling. That's how I came to film really in college, was through this idea that we could use film to learn about ourselves, learn about our culture. And to me, that's the most exciting. And to have your students be able to respond in that way, I think is very exciting as an instructor. And I would argue that while students today are probably more cine-literate than they've ever been, I often wonder if the critical skills have kept pace. And so that's one reason I think an emphasis on teaching film really helps shore up, it helps them develop or hone their critical thinking skills. And I wanted to start here with a, let's see, I'm having trouble, with a clip from The Wizard of Oz. I'm assuming that most of you have seen this. And to me, this clip kind of really brings together so many of the things we can talk about. So as I said, as you watch this, whatever sticks out to you, pop it in the chat or just keep it in your head, and I'll talk about it afterward. All right, let's see. Okay, so classic clip there. You get black and white, which really looks like sepia toned. We start with special effects in that clip, right? As the tornado, which is actually a miniature, spins around. The music underscores the drama of the scene. And one thing I love is it stops and it's almost silent, and I think personally, silence is so underrated in movies. I wish it would be used more for dramatic effect. As Dorothy opens the door, we are introduced with her as our guide, which I think is important for identification, right? And somebody leading us into this new scene, this new land. We are introduced to Oz, but also to color, which when this movie came out in 1939, was relatively new. And this was MGM, the studio that put out the movie. This was their big Technicolor. So this was a big thing for the movie to have at the time. Just as important as all of that, I think, is the production design. From Dorothy's iconic costume and her braids, which were a last minute decision, to her ruby slippers, which we'd see later, and even Toto as an accessory. I think all of that is part of production design, right? The artistic choices, costuming, and then the camera work is important too. I'm just looking here in the chat to see if anybody's dropped anything. Okay. All of that goes a long way. The camera, if you noticed, it's tracking, which means it's moving us through space, right? The camera's not steady, not stationary itself. It's moving us through space. So we finally circle back around and we see Dorothy taking it all in. And it comes to rest on her. So we see her reaction and then we hear her famous line, you know, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. So all of this comes together, obviously, to give us a moment in the film that actually, hopefully, subsumes us in the film. And I always used to tell my students, like, you're going to basically learn in reverse what you already know, you know, if you're new to film language, because from an early age, we are shown images and our brain helps us figure out what the story is. When you teach film literacy, you're sort of teaching how to unpack all of that. And some students get upset. I've noticed they like, oh, I can't go to a movie anymore. I'm like totally analyzing everything. It stinks. It's like, no, that will go away. You know, it'll make you a richer viewer if you understand and have the vocabulary to do all of this. All right, so the next clip I want to look at here, I want to set this up. Let's find my PowerPoint. It's from a small film called Dancer, Texas. It came out in 1989, actually from a Austin Bastrop local, Tim McCanley's. As you watch this clip, think about how character and theme come through, what we learn about rural representations on the screen, and how a narrative deadline is established. And throughout all of these, most of these slides, you'll notice I've put teaks in here, either for language arts, sometimes theater arts or social studies, that you can use to kind of shore up you know, the techniques that I'm talking about and the information that you're getting. This film, if you haven't seen it before, is about 4 high school friends who plan to leave their small town, Dancer, Texas, after graduation. And as I said before, I think it really does a good job of developing character in just this small little bit. All right. Keller represents his group of 4 friends, or 3 friends, who are about to leave. And Earl, who was sitting in the chair holding the umbrella, basically states the theme of this movie. Some folks don't belong in a small town. Some folks don't belong anywhere else. One of the reasons I like this clip is because it really, the whole movie really does show rural. It's rural, which we don't always see on screen in an authentic way. And I think that can speak to you know, students who aren't from big places, or maybe their lives are a little bit smaller. And think about how it's represented on screen. It's dusty. It's a faded color palette that we see. Everything's a little bit toned down. And we've got this interesting Greek chorus of the quote, what I call the men who stayed, right? The ones who didn't leave. And even their mocking tone suggests the differences between Keller's generation, perhaps, youth, progress, and them. They're older, more jaded, perhaps they're even stuck in their lives. You know, if you watch the entire movie, you would have a different impression of them, perhaps. But, you know, I think it's always helpful to talk about the heroes, obviously, in films, but also the antagonists, you know, and what they represent, and what that's really saying to us as viewers. I like how this scene sets up the narrative deadline, and very sort of casually, like, oh, when are you leaving? Monday? Oh, it's Saturday. So there we've got very early in the film, like, boom, you know, these guys have to decide in just 2 days' time. And I don't know if you paid attention to the camera work too much, but it's pretty basic, and that's done for a reason. There are lots of shots to establish the characters and their setting, right? We really want to see how these characters relate to the setting and what their opinion is about where they are. So the shots are big enough to include the background, but not too big that we lose them in the landscape. So we end up with what's called a lot of medium shots. Medium shots tend to be from the waist up or the chest up. So we can see the markers of rural or country or Texas behind them, the pickups, the cowboy hats, the totally bleached out vegetation. So all of that goes together to, you know, work on the theme, to enhance characterization as well. All right. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the original Frankenweenie, which is just, I think, a phenomenal little short. I love it. Tim Burton made it in 1984. He was under contract to Disney. Once he made it, he also got fired by Disney because they really didn't like the dark tone of this. And it was remade as an animated film, I think in 2012. But I think the live action has a lot going on. You be the judge if it's appropriate for showing in your classroom. It starts off with a bang, and that's what we're going to watch. We're going to watch the pre-credit sequence. So as you're watching it, think about the camera work. What's happening? What is the camera doing? Is it moving? Is it still? Is it up high? Is it down low? And how does that affect your interpretation of what's going on and the characters themselves? All right. All right, how many, I'm just curious, how many of you have seen this before? Anybody? Did the raise hands? Okay, a couple people. So as I said earlier, it's a pre-credit sequence, meaning it's action setup that comes before the credit. It gives us a lot of information, right? It sets up the protagonist is Victor, and his conflict, his problem that he lost his dog. The master shot as they come out of the house and sit on the porch is a great way of establishing, you know, we're moving to a different scene, different location, and also sets us up for the action of Victor throwing the ball to Sparky. We move from the relative calm of that shot to the shot reverse shot of Victor throwing the ball and are seeing where it's going. And then it moves into the simulated POV, right, of Sparky, the dog, as we see him chase it. Now, technically the camera's placed in such a way that it's not aligned exactly as if Victor's watching. It's positioned a little bit to the side so we get the full effect, but it's simulated as a reaction shot. When we shift to the second throw, the ball rolls into the street, and we switch from the camera being on the dramatic axis. The dramatic axis is this invisible line that's between, that's supposed to set up tension, either between a character and the camera or the character and an object, right? So it sort of sits on the side to establish the tension between those two people or things. So the camera shifts from that and it moves on axis, and that tends to heighten the tension as we get Sparky's POV on the ball, and we follow him into the street and the camera swivels, right? It does a pan, and sometimes with even anyone, any viewer watching, it's hard sometimes to distinguish between a pan and a tracking shot. So I don't know if you all had time to look at the vocabulary list. A pan is when the camera base is stationary and the top moves, right? A tracking shot is when the camera is moving through space, and that could be many ways. That could be on a small track, that could be on a helicopter, that could be on a crane. So I think helping students understand the difference in those is pretty important to helping them understand what they're looking at and how perspective is achieved on the screen. I also want to point out how the clip deals with genre through all of the horror elements. It's, the horror movie nods, which may or may not be familiar to your students, right? The monsters, the stock monsters that originated literature for some, but, we may know from the Universal horror movies of the 1930s, the tone that's set with the black and white color palette, the music that Burton uses, even starting off with the death kind of, sets us in an interesting place. I told Elizabeth and Laura this. I was teaching I was at an author's workshop and I showed this to a group of fifth graders. I feel like kids lose their pets, right? It's a universal thing, but I think the teacher was really unhappy with this kind of content. So, you're all teaching middle and up. I think this is appropriate, but again, you guys have to be the judge on what's going to work for you. All right, I want to move on to editing, and editing can sometimes be the trickiest in a lot of ways, because if something is edited well, then we don't notice that it's editing, right? That's the point. And so I'm going to go over a few tricks that might help you help your students figure out, how to discuss editing. Let's see. All right, this is the example I'm going to show you is from John Lee Hancock's adaptation of The Blind Side. It's going to go over editing basics, shot reverse shot for reaction and also for dialogue, and then editing for drama as well, and how the length of shots plays into that. And finally, editing for action. One of the reasons I chose this is because it's a football scene, and anytime you've got sports in a movie, especially football, I think editing comes into play if it's done well, basically. All right. So I don't know if you've seen this movie. It was based on Michael Lewis's nonfiction book, which is really about football in general and the story of Michael Oher. The movie really zeroes in on Michael's story, and it features Sandra Bullock. There's a shot in here that, you may be like, ugh, don't want to deal with that in my classroom. I'll talk a little bit more about how you could actually turn that into a discussion point. All right. All right. So this sequence is 4.5 minutes. From a basic editing standpoint, it just uses editing in the beginning to establish characters within their setting, right? We're at football practice, Leanne comes, SJ's there, coach is watching from the sidelines. We get that shot, reverse shot, and the over-the-shoulder shots for the conversation between Michael and Leanne. The drama obviously picks up after Leanne establishes some stakes for Michael. Will he be able to, quote unquote, protect the family that is his team? We've got faster music. In fact, we don't have music until really that starts. And then the way the sequence is edited at that part shifts. When it moves into the action of the football play, in a span of 1 minute from the time the coach asks, you want to run a play, to when that play is over, there are about 21 edits in that 1 minute sequence. And when their sequences are edited for action, the number of cuts increases exponentially to convey speed and movement. So you get shorter shots edited together to convey those things, to convey speed and movement. I think that the number I've always heard is action movies tend to have 4 times as many shots as the regular narrative film. Again, because you're editing to bring the viewer in and bring them into what's going on in the action, to immerse them in what's going on. My son and I just saw Mission Impossible yesterday. Not my kind of movie. He's 15. He chose, but he kept saying, I was so enhanced by it. And I finally said, did you mean entranced? He goes, yes, that's it. And so I was talking to him about, the way all those elements were coming together, which of course he had tuned me out by that point. The best way to train your students or yourself to identify the cuts is to turn off the sound in a clip. I think that really helps you zero in on what's happening visually, and you will watch shots change from one to the other. You can also have, for yourself or your students, have them clap with the sound off every time they see a cut, and that will help them also take in the edits that are happening. And again, that'll help them start to understand, even in documentaries. I think it's so important. I'll have some examples from that later, that students understand that documentaries are edited, they're put together in the same way, because they want to pull the viewer in, they want to engage the viewer. So just a couple of tricks there to help. I'm going to take a minute. I see things piling up in the chat. I just don't want to miss anything. Okay. Film analysis. Okay, I'm glad to hear that so many of you are using this. Yes, the point about video games and media, I think is a good one. And that's what I mean, that I just, with kids on their phones, I just think that to really be able to sort of understand what they're processing, or maybe not processing, especially with social media, I think is important. This isn't just for film, obviously, as some of you have pointed out, video games, anything, ads, bring in social media, look at Instagram and the things, is that an ad? Is that a post? Is that a paid post? What's going on? And just ways that they can start to figure all that out if they haven't already. All right. Let's go back here. All right, I want to show you an example, clip from The Help, an adaptation of Catherine Stockett's best-selling novel. In this sequence, a maid named Minnie, who's played by Octavia Spencer, she crosses a line according to her employer, who is the daughter of her longtime former employer, played by Sissy Spacek. And as we watch this clip, consider how mood is created. How are the particular formal elements used to set the mood for the conflict in this scene? Also keep in mind, it's an adaptation, right? It's a book to screen, and we'll talk about that. I'll come back to this slide too, to make a couple points about that. So the term mise en scène is French and loosely defined. It means putting in the scene. And mise en scène encompasses everything that we see on the screen. Lighting, furniture, costumes, color, and so on. So from the beginning, we've got the sense of the mood of this scene set by the candles and the storm happening outside. Dialogue adds to that, and the sound effects, obviously, for the storm add to that as well. And then consider what the furnishings are telling us about these characters. The furniture choices, the decoration, very traditional, upscale, suggests that the family has money, right? We get that too from the wardrobe of Sissy Spacek and Bryce Dallas Howard. And finally, from Minnie's presence in all of this, right? That this family has a maid, and the way they talk to her, I think that underscores that as well. The racial prejudice at the heart of this scene, and really at the heart of the movie, is amplified by these distinctions and by the stormy setting too, I think. Let me go back to that PowerPoint for a sec here. You could also talk about this clip, as I said earlier, in the movie in terms of adaptation. What changes were made from the book to the film? For instance, in the book, it spreads the story among the characters a little bit more. The maids get their own chapter, and Skeeter, who's played by Emma Stone in the movie, to me at least as a reader, we get perspective a little bit differently than in the film. The film tends to make Skeeter a little bit more of a main character. And I think, these are the things that you pose to your students. Why is that? I would argue it has a lot to do with how the star system works in Hollywood, and even really how movies tend to work, focusing on a goal-oriented protagonist, usually rather than an ensemble, I think is always the first choice for movie makers. And in this particular version of the poster, there are multiple versions of this movie poster. You can't really, you don't see it here, but with this image, Jessica Chastain receives top billing, then Viola Davis. And I think you could really have a good conversation about screen time, how much we see of these characters on screen, how movies get sold, and really how much race plays into Hollywood publicity and even the awards like the Oscars. I think all of that is important to have a conversation about. And it would be really interesting, for instance, I think if you were doing a book to screen adaptation, to then look at like the cover of the book and how it changes once it becomes a movie, and even to line up the posters themselves, and to have your students look at that and discuss, why does this poster look this way? You could even go as far as to say, where was this poster used to advertise this movie? What region of the country? I think that's always useful. I'm thinking about, went back into the classroom in fall of 2021, and I taught a contemporary horror film course, and we looked at Get Out, and we looked at the reviews of Get Out from different parts of the country, and I had my students sort of analyze what was being talked about in terms of race, and I think it was a really helpful exercise. So, think about the context surrounding the text. Sometimes that can also produce other texts for you to use in your classroom, if that makes sense. All right. My final example before the break is from the movie Hotel Transylvania. And I love using animated films because I think we all, really, not just students, have assumptions about who they're for. That's changed a lot. I was a film critic from 1994 to 2003. And even in that, just those 8 years, things changed dramatically in how animated movies were considered in the marketplace. So I think they're really rich to study. I chose this one because it has some quote unquote stars doing the voices. And I think that's an important part of establishing characterization. As you watch this clip, think about voice acting and how that plays into establishing these characters, and also what's at stake when you have a movie about monsters, what you have to consider and maybe what you have to deal with straight off. And this clip is pretty much from the beginning of the movie. I call it Welcome to the Hotel because that's what's going on here. All right, so if you weren't awake before, that probably woke you up with all the craziness there. Same thing with, movies targeted to younger viewers, but this is also obviously targeted to everybody. A lot of action, a lot of things going on to keep people entertained. Adam Sandler, you may have recognized his voice. He voices Dracula. Steve Buscemi provides the voice of Wayne the werewolf. And so granted, they may not be superstars, but they have very distinctive voices. And I think that immediately brings some characterization into their who they're playing. And it's interesting because you've got their quote unquote star persona or their recognizability, but then they're also playing, these stock monster characters. So you've got to combine those two together in terms of, how is that affecting you as a viewer in terms of interpreting their characters. And you've got also the fact that these actors like CeeLo Green's playing the mummy are choosing these parts. It also provides one level of the humor, and it plays, with familiar aspects of their characters, such as portraying the terrifying werewolf, not as terrifying, but a beleaguered family man, with a trillion kids running around. And then finally, we have the use of sound effects, right, that help create the transgressive humor. I don't know if it's still transgressive in 2023, but I don't, fart jokes are classics, really. Bodies out of control, right? That appeals to so many people. I mean, especially if you think about it, adolescents, whose own bodies are out of control. Women in menopause. I mean, you can hit all those, I think, target audiences there. And the characters are being naughty. And I think that is especially appealing to younger viewers as well. As I mentioned before, I was a film critic, and I noticed this change in animation. So there's got to be multiple levels hit, right? There's got to be appeal for the kids who are ostensibly the target audience, but then there's got to be appeal for their caretakers, their parents, whoever, their babysitters, who are actually having to drive them to these places or bring them. And so movies, I think in the last 25 years or so, animated movies are having to work a lot harder and bring in things like, popular soundtracks and stars to give voice, to kind of draw in multiple levels of the audience. So I wanted to just start off, I was reading the comments, the one about Elemental. I haven't seen it yet, but not thinking it was a kid's movie. And Shrek for sure. And April's comment about the Blind Side clip was the word, when he uses the word tit, was that the one I noted? Well, that's one of them. That's one thing that, it's up to you if you want to bring that, show something like that. What I was actually referring to was where Leanne walks away from the team, and you've got that sort of wave of all the guys watching her, I'm assuming her rear end as she walks away. I've had moments where I haven't wanted to deal with that kind of stuff, so I choose a different clip. But then I've also had moments where I'm thinking, okay, let's talk about that, and does it make you uncomfortable? Good, right? So let's talk about why it makes you uncomfortable, because we're encouraged through camera movement and what we're seeing to be voyeurs, basically. I've had some of my best in-class conversations sort of dealing with the awkwardness of what certain clips bring up. Things that are probably more for a college age audience, but still, I think it's important to sort of go there. And as you all know, right, sometimes you go in with your lesson plan and things go awry in a good way because somebody has a reaction, and then it's best to deal with it with the entire class. I've had some really great conversations too, like thinking about the Hotel Transylvania clip, having students discuss. It's a little bit safer, I find, having them discuss what they think is appropriate for young kids to discuss, right? Rather than maybe their own age group that may be too close to home. So for another example I showed with animation, I think it might have been doing live action Frankenweenie and the animated version. I had them read a series of articles about kids in film and content and the PG-13 rating, and when that came in, and sort of what that did then to other content that then had to be put in the R category. It really changed things in terms of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed in films for kids. And I had my students talk about, well, what do they think is appropriate? And I think it might surprise you. Sometimes they're almost Puritans when they talk about, what younger kids should be watching. For themselves, they can watch, NC-17, X, whatever. but for their younger brothers or sisters, they've got very specific ideas. So that's just a thought there about that. And, just, I know this is an older example. I mean, Friday Night Lights, if you want to do sports, Friday Night Lights has lots of great, football scenes. I love Any Given Sunday, Oliver Stone's movie, just for its, I think that's one of the best depicting football on screen, for what that's worth. That's just my opinion, but in terms of the sound, the camera, really capturing what happens on the field, that would also be something you could show, and I think you could, block it in certain ways to show you wouldn't have to deal with a lot of the other stuff in the movie. All right, so for the last 50 or so minutes here before we get to some question time, I've got some activities I want to do. The first one has to do with analyzing primary materials. So I'm going to show you a clip, and you've probably already seen in the Google Classroom the excerpt from Lady Bird Johnson's diary, and we're going to pair those together. Now for this, when I ask you to respond, I don't know, Laura and Elizabeth, do you think it's just easiest to have people put their responses in the chat? Should we do raising their hands? Does anybody?
We're open to both if you are, Alison.
Okay, I am totally. So I guess, unmute yourself if you want to talk, or if you're more comfortable putting your responses in the chat, go ahead. So let me go ahead and start with the screen I want to share. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to show you archival footage of when Lyndon Johnson addressed the joint session of Congress just a week or less, actually, after the assassination of JFK. These teaks here, I believe, are social studies teaks. So you could use this to talk about key figures in politics in the 60s and also the civil rights movement. The activity is, how do camera work? Angles and movement. Angles are where the camera is placed, eye level, up, down, and then the movement obviously is the camera. There's very little camera movement really in this clip. Editing is really, I think, the thing that'll stand out most, and then characterization. How do these all come together to tell the story in this footage that we're seeing? I think that you can guide your students' discussion, if you want to, sort of from a historical standpoint, you can guide it around the idea of presenting history narratively in story form. Is that an effective way of learning history? You can pose that to your students. Why or why not? A question worth asking your students when looking at sort of primary footage like this, documentary footage, I would call it archival because it's not a documentary. We're going to see, I think, the color bars to start. Does this video tell a story? And I think LBJ's administration is interesting in part because of the dramatic way he came into the job. So, as I said, this is a historic address that he made to the joint session of Congress very shortly after taking office. This obviously goes on for another 15 or so minutes, but from just what you saw, going back to my initial question, what's happening with the camera and what's happening with the editing, and how are we getting some semblance of a story here? How can we interpret this history through what we've seen so far? Go to the chat. Let's see. Okay, I think Paul, is this your comment about the clip we just watched? Just, can you nod? Yes, thank you. Okay. It pairs with rhetorical analysis. Yeah, what he's saying is influenced by the way it's presented through technological media. Authorship questions are interesting here. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Can you unmute yourself? I don't know if I can. Are you afraid? Come on, we're all teachers. Okay, I can't hear you.
I know, I'm not afraid. I'm fumbling with the control here. I'm working with my phone, so everything's, in too small a place. The authorship thing is interesting because, in a sense, there's more than one author. There's Johnson, who ostensibly is the author of the presentation, but there's more than one force here in the presentation, in the sense that it's televised, it's through this kind of technological media, and he's not, as far as I know, the director of what's happening here through the cameras and the presentation and how it's presented to a larger public than what's there at the Congress.
Yes, definitely. And you can, depending on how you want to use this and for what subject, right? You can get into all of the politics. I think I just saw Janice's comment go by that kids will need context for this. Certainly, and that's your job. I don't want to spend time going into all the context because you can use this in a number of ways. But yeah, to try to capture, and I wasn't alive when this happened, but I mean, I think you can use historical things to convey what was going on. I mean, when you cut to the shot of the family, right? Lady Bird and the daughters, yes, it's a black and white. It's a little hard to see, but everybody's in black, right? Everybody was wearing black because the whole nation was mourning. The reason I cut it where I did was, I think the edit to Bobby Kennedy is fascinating because yes, he's devastated at the loss of his brother, but he and LBJ also had such, a fraught relationship, and that's probably a polite way of really describing their relationship at this moment in time. And so you could talk to your students about that too. This is archival footage. This was a particular shot that was chosen, right? That edit from LBJ to a shot that includes RFK, that's intentional. And so to talk about that would be helpful. I see Nina's comment about the effects of repetition are one of the many powerful tools used here. Yes, for sure. And building on that, you could also talk about pomp, right? The pomp of these rituals, the applause, the endless applause. I mean, I find as a viewer that makes it like, oh, and that could just be my contemporary approach to politics too. So again, another area for discussion perhaps with your students if you want to go there. Let me see, as they go back and forth between him and the audience, yeah, you can see who is for the topics and who is against, right? And that's really what he's setting up here. He's setting up, here's my agenda, right? We're all grieving. I mean, somebody mentioned this earlier, and forgive me that, I think it was Janice, about like there was relief that we had a leader too. So there are a lot of things going on here. Okay, frequent changes in angle to include the adoring, supportive audience, right? Yes, Wendy's point about there's also a speechwriter who wrote the script. I would even say, especially given that it's LBJ, I mean, think about the relationships that perhaps we didn't even know about at the time, right? The behind the scenes brokering and all of that we know thanks to archival materials that are now available, even the sort of the waves of how archival materials get released. Sometimes there's stuff still being held back until certain members of administrations have passed away. I mean, that's also worth discussing too. Who makes these decisions? Is that effective for us as citizens to have, somebody sort of orchestrating that? Is that okay? I think you could have really interesting discussions about privacy and confidentiality in terms of national security along those lines too. Okay, I'm scrolling. Yep, shots. I mean, I would say overall the camera work is pretty basic, right? We're just dealing with the footage, and there's some editing going on. There's not any music, but there's definitely, as I said, intent, and there's definitely, we form opinions based on what we're seeing. So I would say then you could layer on top of this the excerpt, the thing that was in the Google Docs from Lady Bird Johnson's diary. And I've just done a short a short excerpt on the PowerPoint. So let me go back to that screen sharing here. Oh, sorry, it keeps reverting back. All right, so you may have read the whole excerpt. Just take a minute to read this little bit and then think about, what does it add to our understanding of that address? So what does that do to your interpretation, perhaps, of the clip I just showed? Right. Kristen said just how aware she was of the weight on her husband. The role of first ladies, while it's been written about, I think in the last maybe decade, there's been a renewed focus on looking at first ladies, like reconsidering first ladies and how we can appreciate their roles. And obviously their role has changed over time. You could talk about the relationship that Lady Bird had with her husband. She was often a frequent contributor and critic of his speeches. But I also think this shows us another side to consider, that these are actual human beings, right? Who were sort of, in this case, thrust into this moment, and how that might affect what's going on with the country, right? And things that are being decided. Yeah, was but a mere human. Yeah, the analogy at the end. Ooh, it's going so fast, I'm trying to keep up. Yeah, April made the point about attribution, and also you could talk about, her diaries, that's actually a book that's available. And you could talk to your students about editing within that book. Obviously it was edited for historical reasons. It was edited too, I think, for I think the Johnsons, the family is very aware of legacy and image, and you could bring that in as well and have a discussion about that. Yeah, she was numb. Lady Bird was numb, but she needed to find new resolve. Another way to look at these kinds of things too, during the pandemic, I was finishing up my last book, and we all know how everything was suddenly shut down. So I was forced to go online to find a lot of newspaper things. So I'm sure newspapers.com. I think it's a great resource. Obviously LexisNexis and any kind of searchable thing, but finding old newspaper articles, I find so helpful. And what I remind my students is that, this isn't always showing us what people were feeling, right? But it's showing us what gatekeepers were communicating to people at the time. And that's one way to consider using things like newspapers and magazine articles and all of that. Any questions about this or what I've gone over so far in terms of this? No? All right, I'm going to move on to this group activity. Laura, do I need to? I'll talk about it a little bit first, okay? So when I last taught in the fall of 2021, I had a lot of success using this particular group activity, and you can apply it to any clip. And I really think with just about any size group. And you're basically asking your students to put into practice the critical skills they've been developing or they've been honing, and you're helping them learn to work collaboratively, which I just think is an important tool. It's something personally I struggle with, but I think it's good to sort of help them learn, because honestly, the way like the world is going, they're going to end up having to work on teams, and probably in some way or another in whatever kind of field they go into. So I just think it's good to help them in that way. So here's what I'm going to do. This is a clip from the documentary about Taylor Swift, Miss Americana. We're going to watch it. Then Laura's going to help me. We're going to assign groups, right? You're going to be assigned to a group, and you're going to have a specific film element you're looking at, whether that's camera angles or camera movement or characterization. You're going to go into your breakout rooms. You're going to discuss how that was done in the clip. You're going to choose a leader, somebody who will come back and speak for the group about how your element contributes to the overall whole of the clip I've shown you. And that's it. And then I think we'll move on to questions at the time. All right, so let's take a look at the clip to start. I'm going to show you the PowerPoint first, just so you can see the teaks related to it. Other questions to consider: what are these elements telling us about stardom, performance, and even women in the music industry? All right. I am eager to hear what y'all came up with. How about group one? Who's your person? Tell me what your element was and what y'all discussed.
Okay, I'm Wendy Taylor, and I'm the spokesperson for group one. I'm going to pull up the questions because we talked and I didn't write at the same time. So I kind of have to have those sheets in front of me. So the camera shots and angles was our element. And we felt like the combination of close-ups and mediums and far away shots were telling us the story of the beginning, middle, and current career, sort of how she began, giving us close-ups of family and home video and selfie phone video, to the mid-range of the progression of her career to the current, where she is now-ish. So just that arc, we felt like that was done. We really got into the stardom, performance, and women in the music industry stuff because we get the beginning when she was just a little girl, and we see just the innocence of her playing with the kitten and her writing in her diary and her as a little girl opening her guitar for Christmas. And then the end shot where you caught it was that, like, looking over her shoulder, kind of watching everybody check her out, and she's kind of come into this womanhood element. And so just the arc of stardom, her enjoyment of performance, and how it goes from just being a little, cringy as a kid, and then being just such a professional and enjoying everybody's adoration. We also questioned documentaries about male performers and if they would be addressing the little boy becoming a man and the sexuality aspect of that, as everybody watches that. So those are all good things, definitely.
Okay, because I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Wendy. Let's move to group two. Who is that? And
hi.
Hi. Kim.
Okay, so we had camera movement, which kind of similar, I guess, to camera shots and angles, because I felt like the movement was very slow at the beginning when she was at her house.
Yeah.
And then it just cut to like a montage of all of her home videos, which there was a lot happening with each of those. And I thought it kind of reflected the fast pace that her life took off with. As far as the camera movement and how it affects her as a female. I mean, the thing that I focused on was at the very end. It kind of zoomed right into her while she's on stage. Obviously, she's made it as a big star. But I thought it was interesting because her tone and word choice throughout what she was saying, like things like being patted on the head and wanting acceptance, kind of reflected that it was a struggle for her as a female in the music industry.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to point out too that there's a lot of handheld in there, right? and you know, we're so sort of used to handheld that it's become, you know, we know how when it's spoofed, right? And what it conveys, and think about that in terms of intimacy, you know, versus a camera on a tripod. And we get a little bit more of that authenticity through the handheld. Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. How about group 3?
Hi, I'm Crystal. And we had sound with music and voiceover, and we also tried to keep your questions in the intro in mind. But we really thought that it was telling Taylor's story from her own point of view and her own voice, that the music made everything elegant and feminine, along, you know, kind of with the way that she was being portrayed on camera, that the theme overall was really Americana, and that things were reinforcing this, such as using the national anthem, or her talking about basically being the good girl stereotype, and having to stay goal focused, and doing what was expected. Kind of her image is like the girl next door. So by behaving in such a manner was the only way that she could be successful as she was telling that story. And that it shows, you know, the woman's perspective in this patriarchal industry.
Yeah, there's kind of a double layer too with the women's perspective. The director of this, you know, which if you were doing this in a class, you'd bring in more of these elements, is Lana Wilson. And she did a great documentary before this. I'm forgetting the exact name, but it's about backup singers. So she definitely has this female focus. And forgive me if you said this already, but also having Taylor's voice sort of be the first voice we hear, I think is very important in establishing identity in this particular documentary, you know, giving her voice, especially if you want to weigh that in light of her, you know, struggle for her own music, right? The music rights. And I don't want to say too much and step on somebody else's group. Thank you, Crystal. And group 4?
Okay, so I kind of feel like characterization draws off of all the other elements, so we probably stole things from what everybody else said. But we've already kind of been over the fact that she's presented in the beginning with all the stereotypical feminine elements. She's wearing pink. She's got little pink, like not fake nails, just her natural nails painted pink. She's literally playing with a kitten while she's playing this little piano piece. And she's got her little pink diaries. She's like the total good girl stereotype. And then as we progress through her rising to stardom, there's a lot more focus on her outfits and her physical appearance through the camera angles and the music, especially. I don't want to step on those sound people's toes, but there's this buildup of where we're getting to, you know, the shot that says the name of the documentary, to where we can see she's had this successful acquisition of what she's been seeking. She says she's been raised to seek approval, and that's what makes her tick. And it kind of seems like that's where she is when we get to the end of those clips. And like y'all have been discussing, I think that's probably primarily because she's a female performer. That's not probably the same motivation she would have been given if she was a male.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's interesting too. I mean, somebody used the word cringy earlier about her. Like, I mean, the part where she shushes her mom is fascinating to me. You know, I mean, she's definitely got power, you know, at that age, and that dynamic is interesting. And where she says, you know, I am happy when she opens the guitar. To me, that's kind of bizarre. And I'm not saying your job is to psychoanalyze the subject, but I'm saying these are all also elements of characterization. You know, for the hardcore Taylor Swift fans, I am not, so I don't know all the things, but I mean, starting with one of her cats, right? She's got like, she's a cat lady, you know, in a good sense. So I mean, there's like levels of investment, I think, for the viewer. You know, if you're just a casual viewer who's intrigued by this, there's a way in. If you're a hardcore, is it Swiftie, then, you know, you can do a deep dive, you know. So I think that weighs in as well. Thank you, Laura. Do we have 2 more groups? Are we doing okay on time, Elizabeth and Laura? Can we keep going? Okay. Group 5, 6? I've
Yes.
lost count.
5.
5.
So we have Ms. Insane, and we talked about that good girl label and how she's internalized it, what other people mentioned as well, the need for approval, the things that we noticed kind of creating all this, the pink at the beginning, that stereotypical kind of feminine. We have phases, the very, very young Taylor Swift, and then as she gets older, the brainstorming, her smudged ink, to the rising superstar. So it's like from roots to stardom. The crowd sizes, how they increase with the building stardom, pointing out the number 60 on the chart. So having those kinds of things in there. We talked about like the sparkles. I really like the tear away, the band nerd tear away clothes to this whole sparkle. But I think that also is sort of commenting on the difficulties that women face in the industry. You can't be a successful band nerd. You got to razzle dazzle with the sparkle. You got to have the good makeup and all of the costuming to really catch people's eye. So a little, harder than the male counterparts. It's kind of things that we talked about kind of leading up. Oh, and then she's able to laugh at her flashbacks, like of who she was and all of that as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
It's not embarrassment. It's just sort of part of who she is.
Right. And all the trappings that we associate with success. She goes from singing in a stand-up mic at wherever that was, when somebody yells out, "Hi, Taylor," from the audience, to having the earpiece and having security. So those are things that can go into a discussion of that as well. And again, your students are way familiar with this stuff, from going to shows themselves to just watching all of this. Thank you, Ashley. Okay, I think we have one more group.
Okay, we'll go very quickly as we're reiterating a lot of what other people said. The editing goes kind of from blurry to clearer and clearer as it goes on with the mishmatching of these older clips. And by doing that, we get this kind of nostalgic view of her as a child. And then, as mentioned, things get shinier and shinier. The more she becomes a woman, the views of her face become views of her body. And that, again, in order to be successful in this industry, you have to be a good girl or a good woman, but still look really shiny.
Always shiny. Yeah. And also with the editing, I don't know if I mentioned this, but you all seem to recognize that this is, again, a pre-credit sequence. So we've got this very fast, like, here's the story. I think the first person, Wendy, mentioned this, the narrative arc, here we go. And of course, then the rest of the documentary will kind of unpack that, right? And show us the behind the scenes. So you could also talk about that with your students as well, depending on how much you end up showing them of any particular thing, right? These are just, when I use this in my classroom, my students had seen the film as a whole by this point. So I was asking them to zero in a little bit more and forcing them to really go specific and to have them start using this. I taught film, still my students would struggle with the terms. I provided a vocabulary list. There are TEKs in there that require vocab. So you could easily do some kind of assignment that would test them on that. I mean, I would say, I didn't do this to you guys because this is just, 2-hour thing, but, be more specific. What's happening with the camera? Is it handheld? Like, as best we can tell, right? We weren't there on the set, but I would hold them to things like that. I know we're running out of time. I want to take questions, but I also just want to throw out 2 ideas. Barbie, Hello Barbie, it's everywhere. Once that streams, I think that would be a phenomenal text to use in the classroom. You may or may not know, if I'm getting my history of Barbie right, that I think the woman who created Barbie was inspired by the German doll that was actually a prostitute. You know, do you want to bring that in? I don't know, but I'm just saying it's such a loaded text, Barbie. Also, the primary doc example I gave you, I would throw out Flaming Hot, the new feature from Eva Longoria. There's been a lot of judgment of her and questioning of that story. Is it real? Is it not? She wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, I believe. I would pair that with a clip from that movie and talk about that with your students. I think that would be a great example. Finally, another activity you could have them do is video essays. My students were like so theoretically hot for video essays. Like, please let us make video essays. I was like, okay, make a video essay. And of course you have to have certain parameters because to grade them. So, be very specific about that. They have to hit certain marks. In the end, only 2 of my 28 students made them. I was like, okay, what was all with this, uproar? But anyway, I think it's a good option for them, especially students, who may approach learning in a different way. I think that gives them another outlet. All right, that was a pretty fast blah, blah, blah. What about questions here? I see some chat stuff. Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Traditionally, teachers, a lot of teachers that I have known will show the video of a book they're reading at the end as kind of a reward, and then they might do a little contrast, compare and contrast. What's a better way to do that? Side by side, or, I just want it to be a little more academic instead of just, okay, we finished the book, here, watch the movie.
Yeah. Well, the thing I suggested earlier, maybe about posters, like how the movie then is marketed, or, often what happens is a book cover gets redone when there's a movie attached, and that usually is like, featuring the stars, like soon to be a major motion picture. So you can talk about what that does to, you could even send them, I don't know, on a field trip to the bookstore on a weekend, is this book now placed somewhere else in the bookstore kind of thing, There's so many ways in looking at how the book and the movie are reviewed, and maybe dividing class into groups. And this could be like over, multiple weeks perhaps, and then having them like face off against each other, something like that. But I do think adaptation is rich. I taught a whole course on it actually with film years ago. And I just think expectations of what we have for different media, books versus film, really plays into that. So I hope that helps. Other questions? And thank you, Clay. I see your comment. I appreciate that. I'm reading, yeah, Laura's point about costume changes. And thank you for the person who put the name of Lana Wilson's other documentary in the chat, 10 Feet from Stardom. Okay, Kristen had a suggestion, Wendy, I believe, in the chat about another way to do the compare and contrast. Oh, did I miss another one? Laura says, I don't know if you're all reading this. I don't mean to mom you. I'm just reading them because I thought it'd be helpful. My students tend to be incensed about the changes made to a film from the book. Sometimes you can have great discussion about why those decisions are made. Yeah, or why they're incensed. I mean, they're consumers. I would definitely get into how they consume. And I know it can be tough territory sometimes. They may not want to share those things in a public discussion with their peers, but you could have it a writing assignment. What did you want from the film that you loved in the book, or why are you offended that this character was reduced or, you know, given more of screen time. I think those are all valid